Tennessee history, a land of hidden origins and ancient echoes. Tennessee, a state cloaked in legend, stretched wide across the upper South of the United States. Officially admitted as the 16th state of the Union in 1796, its geography is as enigmatic as its past. This land reaches 432 miles from the misty ridges of the Appalachian Mountains on the eastern edge to the mighty flow of the Mississippi River in the west. And yet, it is narrow, just 112 miles from north to south, a corridor where history whispers through valleys and over forgotten battlefields. Nashville may be its capital, Memphis its largest city, but the true heart of Tennessee lies hidden beneath centuries of transformation. Before the settlers, before the states, there was something older. Long before Tennessee had a name, it was home to ancient peoples, the first Tennesseans. More than 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age, humans crossed a vanished land bridge from Asia. These Paleo-Indians hunted mammoth and mastodon in dense prehistoric forests. Time moved on. The archaic people emerged, then the woodland culture, and finally, the Mississippian civilization, a society that mastered both the hunt and the harvest. They built earth mounds, traded widely, and formed powerful chiefdoms that ruled the river valleys. And then came the outsiders. In 1540, the Spanish conquistador Hernando de Soto arrived, drawn by tales of golden cities. But he found no riches, only thriving indigenous nations. By the 1700s, the Chickasaw ruled the western lands, while the Cherokee held the east. These tribes were more than inhabitants. They were the keepers of a deep, unwritten history. What happened next would change everything. Tennessee history, rebellion, betrayal, and the rise of a nation. The name Tennessee echoes from a deeper past, drawn from the ancient Cherokee village of Tennessee. At first, the Cherokee welcomed English traders from the Virginia and South Carolina colonies. There was trust. There was alliance. Together, they stood against the French during the brutal struggles of the French and Indian War in the 1750s and 60s. But harmony has a short half-life in lands rich with promise. As traders became settlers, and settlers became invaders, the Cherokee watched their lands disappear. What began as partnership turned to suspicion, then to war. Sporadic, bitter conflict haunted the valleys and ridges for decades. And in the end, the story turned tragic. The final removal of the Cherokee people from Tennessee in the 19th century, a shadow cast over the state's future. But conflict did not stop with the tribes. Even the English settlers, far from royal authority, began forging their own path. In 1772, settlers in Upper East Tennessee, realizing they were beyond the Crown's reach, dared to govern themselves. They formed the Watauga Association, a bold experiment in self-rule that would echo across history. Not long after, those settling near what would become Nashville signed the Cumberland Compact, continuing the tradition of independence. And when revolutions stirred across the colonies, Tennessee's rebels stepped forward. In 1780, at the Battle of Kings Mountain, they clashed with Loyalist forces, colonists still loyal to Britain, and delivered a crushing blow. This unlikely victory helped tip the scales of the American Revolution. It was a message: Tennessee was not a frontier, it was a force. From rebellion to recognition. After the war, Tennessee was claimed by North Carolina. But its people had other ideas. They attempted to form their own state, Franklin, a bold but short-lived bid for independence. The Continental Congress refused their petition. Still, their dream didn't die. Under the newly formed United States, the region was reorganized into the territory south of the River Ohio. And then, in 1796, the dream became reality. Tennessee became the 16th state in the Union, the first born from territory, not former colony. Knoxville was named the capital. John Sevier became its first governor. And a rising frontier figure named Andrew Jackson took his place as Tennessee's first congressman. But Jackson's story was only just beginning. Tennessee history, warriors, presidents, and the long shadow of power. By the early 1800s, Tennessee had become more than a state. It was a proving ground for power. And no figure loomed larger than Andrew Jackson. In 1813, war erupted in the South. The Creek War had begun, a deadly conflict between Native American resistance and American expansion. After the brutal Fort Mims massacre, Tennessee's citizens answered the call. They came not as ordinary soldiers, but as volunteers, a title that would forever brand the state. Among them was Davy Crockett, and at their helm stood Jackson himself. At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814, deep in Alabama's wilderness, Jackson led a decisive assault that shattered the resistance of the Upper Creek, Muskogee. Towns were razed. Villages fell silent. It was victory, but at a cost. A legacy of blood would follow. And yet, this would not be Jackson's final war. In 1815, at New Orleans, Jackson crushed the British in a stunning triumph at the end of the War of 1812. The nation hailed him as a savior, a man of the frontier who spoke not for the elite, but for the people. In 1828 he ascended to the presidency. But Jackson's image was more complex than legend suggests. As president, he waged war on the National Bank, reshaped the Democratic Party, and most fatefully, led the campaign to remove all Native American nations from the eastern United States. Despite efforts by the Cherokee of East Tennessee to adopt European American customs, laws, and lifestyles, Jackson's policies were unrelenting. In 1838, the U.S. government began the forcible removal of the Cherokee, a harrowing journey westward known as the Trail of Tears. Men, women, and children were marched from their ancestral lands to a new, unfamiliar place, what is now Oklahoma. Thousands died along the way. Tennessee's valleys, once alive with indigenous memory, were left eerily silent. Tennessee turns on its own hero. As Jackson's power grew, so too did resistance. In Washington, a new political force emerged, the Whig Party, born from the fierce opposition to what critics called the tyranny of King Andrew. National voices like Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun battled his influence. In Tennessee, Whigs like John Bell and Hugh Lawson White rose to challenge Jacksonian dominance. Ironically, while Jackson held the presidency, Tennessee's own political heart leaned Whig. And in 1844, another Tennessean, James K. Polk, Jackson's protege, was elected President of the United States. But even he faced rejection from his home state, which voted against him. In Tennessee, loyalty was never simple. Power was never secure. Tennessee history, a state divided by fire and bound by blood. By 1860, a storm was gathering. The nation stood on the edge of war. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a known opponent of slavery's expansion, sent a chill through the South. One by one, Southern states began to secede from the Union. And yet, at first, Tennessee hesitated. Many Tennesseans, torn between loyalty to the Union and allegiance to Southern traditions, watched cautiously. But as war became inevitable in 1861, the state made its choice. Tennessee seceded, joining the Confederate States of America. The die was cast, and what followed was devastation. Only Virginia witnessed more bloodshed than Tennessee. The state became a battleground, a violent crossroads of the American Civil War. From the thunder of Fort Donelson to the carnage at Shiloh, the brutal clash at Stones River, the siege of Chattanooga, the burning of Franklin, and the battle for Nashville, the land itself was scarred. Farms were leveled. Cities were shattered. Families were torn apart. By 1864, the Union Army had occupied most of Tennessee, leaving behind a war-torn shell of a state. But even in war, Tennessee remained fractured. In Middle and West Tennessee, loyalties lay with the Confederacy. But in the rugged mountains of the East, a different spirit endured. East Tennessee, fiercely independent, refused to bend. Many in the region remained loyal to the Union, and some even tried to form a separate, pro-Union state. This fracture was embodied in one man, Andrew Johnson. A Democrat, a former governor, and U.S. Senator, Johnson remained loyal to the Union. Appointed military governor of Tennessee during the war, his defiance of the planter elite and his unwavering support for Lincoln's cause made him both a hero and a target. Threats, even of assassination, followed him across the state. Reconstruction. A new struggle begins. When the guns fell silent in 1865, Tennessee entered a new battlefield, Reconstruction. But unlike the rest of the South, Tennessee moved quickly. It was the first Confederate state readmitted to the Union. Still, peace did not come easily. The years that followed were shaped by the fiery leadership of William G. Brownlow, a radical Republican, newspaper editor, and minister from Knoxville. Serving as governor from 1865 to 1869, Brownlow ruled with unyielding resolve. Like Johnson, he scorned the plantation aristocracy, refused compromise, and became a polarizing force in a fractured land. For Tennessee, the war had ended, but the battle for its soul had only just begun. Tennessee history, power, protest, and the turning of the American century. As the Civil War ended, a former tailor from East Tennessee stood at the helm of a fractured nation. Andrew Johnson, chosen as Lincoln's vice president in 1864 to bridge the North-South divide, was suddenly thrust into the presidency after Lincoln's assassination in 1865. But peace would not come easily. Johnson's loyalty to the Union was never in doubt, but his leniency toward the defeated South made him a target of the radical Republicans in Congress. In 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach him, accusing him of siding too closely with former Confederates. Yet when the Senate fell short by just one vote, Johnson escaped removal, and in a twist of fate, became a hero to many Tennesseans who had once despised him. But Tennessee was already slipping back into the grip of its old masters. By 1871, conservative Democrats, many with deep Confederate ties, regained power. They wasted no time, dismantling Reconstruction reforms and restoring pro-plantation, anti-black policies. A dark chapter had returned, cloaked in familiar robes. Cracks in the old order, 1900 to World War II. As the 20th century dawned, Tennessee's soul remained divided. Inside the dominant Democratic Party, bitter factions fought for control, while social crusades like prohibition and women's suffrage ignited passions on both sides. It was during this ideological chaos that a small town in East Tennessee, Dayton, became the epicenter of a national spectacle. In 1925, a young biology teacher stood trial in the famous Scopes monkey trial, charged with teaching Darwin's theory of evolution. The courtroom became a battlefield between science and scripture, progress and tradition. Tennessee, and America, stood transfixed as the past clashed with the future. By the 1930s, the Great Depression ravaged the state. But reform found its voice again under Governor Gordon Browning in 1936, who led a movement to restructure the state's finances and rebuild public trust. Then came one of the most transformative forces in Tennessee's history, the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. Launched in 1933 as part of President Roosevelt's New Deal, the TVA constructed a sweeping network of hydroelectric dams throughout East Tennessee and beyond. It brought light, jobs, and hope, reshaping the economy and carving a path to modernity. Yet even that was only the beginning. In the shadows of the Smoky Mountains, the quiet town of Oak Ridge was chosen as a secret site for the Manhattan Project, America's atomic bomb program. By World War II, Tennessee wasn't just witnessing history, it was helping to make it. A new South emerges, Tennessee in the modern age. The post-war years brought new battles, not of armies, but of ideas. Under the leadership of Governors Frank Clement and Buford Ellington, Tennessee invested in education, mental health, infrastructure, and constitutional reform. Yet beneath this progress, old tension simmered. The fight for civil rights erupted into the streets of Tennessee's cities. In Nashville, Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Memphis, African Americans protested the deep scars of segregation. The Nashville sit-ins of 1959 to 61 captured national attention, symbols of a rising movement that refused to be silenced. But the cost was high. In 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. traveled to Memphis to support striking sanitation workers demanding dignity and fair treatment. There, on April 4th, he was assassinated. A Tennessee court later convicted James Earl Ray, but questions lingered, as they always do when power and justice collide. Tennessee, a land once torn by war, reborn in struggle and remade in protest, has always stood at the crossroads of conflict and transformation. Its story is not just one of battles and borders, but of voices rising, systems falling, and a people always pushing forward. Tennessee history, echoes of power in a modern age. As the fires of the 20th century cooled, Tennessee stood at another crossroads, not of war, but of political transformation. After decades of Democratic dominance, the 1960s brought the revival of two-party politics. What had once been Republican strongholds only in East Tennessee now began to shift. Middle and West Tennesseans, drawn by new political ideologies, helped tip the balance. By the 1970s, the governor's office seesawed between the parties. But by the mid-1990s, Tennessee's voice in Washington grew increasingly red. From 1995 onward, both U.S. Senate seats belonged to Republicans, and the majority of the state's congressional delegation followed suit. Yet, even in an era of partisanship, Tennessee produced one of the most prominent Democrats of a generation, Al Gore. Born of Tennessee soil, Gore served as Vice President of the United States from 1993 to 2001 and became the Democratic presidential nominee in the tightly contested 2000 election. Into the 21st century, a state in motion. As a new century dawned, Tennessee's story entered a quieter, but no less profound chapter. Population surged, especially in the suburban corridors surrounding Nashville, Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Memphis. While the state's ethnic composition remained relatively stable, the Hispanic community expanded, reshaping cultural and economic landscapes. The service sector thrived, with shipping, healthcare, entertainment, and hospitality driving growth. Meanwhile, Tennessee's factories found new life on assembly lines. The automobile industry injected new strength into the state's manufacturing core. From prehistoric hunters to atomic cities, from battlefields to boardrooms, Tennessee's past is not a closed book. It is a living history, always unfolding. Love stories like this? Then subscribe to History Love, your home for deep dives into the untold corners of American history. Don't forget to like, share, and comment below what surprised you most about Tennessee's journey. And hit the bell icon so you never miss the next chapter in history. This is History Love, where the past is never silent.